There comes a moment often unnoticed, sometimes misunderstood, when a subtle dissatisfaction begins to stir within the sincere seeker. It is not rebellion. It is not doubt. It is not a loss of faith. On the contrary, it arises precisely because faith has been earnest, prayer has been faithful, and the heart has genuinely sought God. Yet something within whispers that effort has reached its limit. The soul, having traveled far on the path of seeking, begins to feel a holy weariness, not with God, but with striving. Many mistake this moment as spiritual failure. They assume they have not prayed enough, studied enough, surrendered enough. But this weariness is not a sign of distance from God. It is a sign of nearness. It is the soul's recognition that the answer it seeks cannot be reached by further effort. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, Jesus said, and I will give you rest. He did not say, come and labor more. He pointed to rest not as reward, but as revelation. This dissatisfaction is quiet. It does not shout. It does not accuse. It does not demand. It simply makes itself known as a gentle sense that something essential has been missed. The seeker may still attend worship, still read scripture, still pray faithfully, yet there is an unspoken knowing that the life of God has not yet been fully realized as present. The heart may echo the words of the psalmist, as the hart panteth after the water brooks, so panteth my soul after thee, O God. And yet, even in that longing, there is the beginning of a deeper question. Why does the seeking itself feel incomplete? At this stage, the soul is not asking for more truth. It is asking for reality. It is no longer satisfied with second-hand understanding, inherited belief, or borrowed inspiration. The words of Scripture may still inspire, but they no longer quiet the inner ache. The seeker senses, often without being able to name it, that God must be nearer than prayer suggests, closer than worship implies, more intimate than belief has allowed. Be still and know that I am God. The call is not to more activity, but to stillness, because only in stillness can what is already present be recognized. This is the moment when the soul begins to outgrow the idea of God as something to be reached. The personal sense of I am seeking God begins to feel subtly false, not wrong, but incomplete. And this is important. The soul does not abandon God at this point. It abandons effort. It abandons strain. It abandons the belief that truth is attained by accumulation. Jesus spoke to this when he said, the kingdom of God cometh not with observation, for behold, the kingdom of God is within you. The dissatisfaction arises because the soul is beginning to remember where the kingdom has always been. Often, this stage is accompanied by silence, not forced silence, but natural. The seeker may find that words fall away in prayer. Requests feel unnecessary. Petitions feel misplaced. There may be moments where one simply sits without asking, without affirming, without denying, because something deeper is stirring. This is not emptiness. It is expectancy without demand. The prophet Habakkuk spoke from this place when he said, the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. Here, the soul begins to sense that the real obstacle has never been God's absence, but the assumption of separation. And yet, this realization is not yet clear. It is felt more than understood. The dissatisfaction is the soul's way of loosening its grip on the personal sense of identity that has been quietly managing the spiritual journey. The seeker has not yet seen the personal I as the veil, but the veil has begun to thin. This is the sacred threshold. Nothing dramatic occurs here. No visions, no voices, no declarations. Only a gentle inward turning. The seeker may still call themselves a seeker, but the heart is already being prepared for a different discovery, a discovery not of something new, but of something so intimate, so immediate, that it has been overlooked. In Him, we live and move and have our being. These words begin to feel less like poetry and more like fact. And so, if you recognize this quiet dissatisfaction within yourself, do not attempt to fix it. Do not cover it with more effort. Do not interpret it as lack. It is the soul's readiness to move beyond seeking into recognition. It is the first sign that the personal I is nearing the end of its role as spiritual doer. Something greater is about to be revealed, not added, not achieved, not earned, but uncovered. This dissatisfaction is grace. It is the gentle hand of God loosening the seeker's grip on effort, preparing the way for a revelation that cannot come through striving. And in this still, unannounced moment, the soul stands unknowingly at the edge of its most liberating discovery. As this quiet dissatisfaction deepens, something extraordinary begins to occur, though it may not yet be recognized as such. The soul, having exhausted outer forms and inner effort, begins to turn not outward, not upward, but inward toward the very sense of I that has been seeking. And here, gently, without judgment or criticism, a profound discovery waits. The final veil between consciousness and God is not sin, not fear, not ignorance. It is the personal sense of I itself. This must be understood carefully, for there is great misunderstanding here. The personal I is not the body. It is not the human personality with its name, history, talents, and limitations. These are appearances. The personal I is the belief that this appearance is the doer, the thinker, the seeker, the one living life. It is the assumption, so subtle it often goes unquestioned, that there is a separate entity here who must pray, must seek, must achieve God, must manage life, must carry responsibility for existence. This personal I is not evil. It is not something to be fought or condemned. It has served a purpose. It is the sense of identity through which humanity learned, grew, struggled, and matured. But there comes a moment inevitable for every soul when this sense of authorship becomes a limitation rather than a support. The very I that once sought God faithfully now stands as the final barrier to recognition. Even spiritual life, sincere and devoted, often strengthens this personal sense without realizing it. I am praying. I am surrendering. I am trying to trust God. These statements sound humble, but they quietly place a personal self at the center of the divine relationship. They assume a seeker here and a God there, and as long as this assumption remains, the experience of separation must continue, no matter how refined the belief. Jesus spoke from a consciousness entirely free of this personal sense. That is why his words carry such depth when truly heard. Why callest thou me good? There is none good but one, that is, God. He was not deflecting praise. He was revealing identity. Again and again, he refused to take personal ownership of the divine action. The Father that dwelleth in me, he doeth the works. In that statement, the personal I disappears. What remains is divine authorship. The personal I is the last veil because it is the most intimate. One may give up beliefs, habits, attachments, even self-image, yet still hold tightly, though unconsciously, to the sense of being the one who is living, choosing, directing, and striving. This is why the end of personal sense feels so radical to human thought. The mind fears that without this I, something essential will be lost. But what is lost is only the illusion of separation. What remains is life itself. Scripture points to this more often than is recognized. I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. This is not poetry. It is revelation. Paul was not describing moral improvement or religious devotion. He was describing the dissolution of personal authorship. The I that once claimed ownership of life had yielded to the Christ, the impersonal presence of God expressing as being. The personal I believes it must carry burdens. It believes it must fix problems, protect itself, plan outcomes, and secure the future. And because it believes this, life becomes heavy. Jesus addressed this directly when he said, "Take no thought for your life, for your Father knoweth what things ye have need of." This was not advice for better living. It was a disclosure of a different identity, one in which life is not managed personally, but lived divinely. As long as the personal I remains unquestioned, fear remains inevitable. Fear is not caused by circumstances, it is caused by personal authorship. A self that believes it must survive, succeed, and control will always fear loss. But when the personal I begins to loosen its grip, fear begins to fade, not because conditions change, but because identity does. This is why the soul's dissatisfaction could not be resolved by more effort. Effort belongs to the personal I. The soul was not asking for better effort. It was preparing for release. The discovery that lies ahead is not how to improve the personal self, but how to see that the personal self was never the source of life to begin with. Before Abraham was, I am. Not I was, not I became. I am eternal, impersonal presence. At this stage, the seeker does not yet abandon the personal I. That comes later, naturally, gently, without force, but awareness begins to notice it. One begins to see how often the word I is used, how quickly it attaches itself to conditions, roles, fears, desires. And in this noticing, without effort or judgment, the veil begins to thin. The personal I is the last veil because it is the most convincing. It feels like you. And yet, the moment awareness turns toward it, a deeper question arises, one that cannot be answered by the mind. Who is the I that is aware of this personal self? That question does not seek an answer. It prepares the way for silence. And in that silence, the personal I will eventually be seen not as identity, but as appearance. This is not the end yet. It is the approach. The soul has now been brought to the threshold where the personal sense can no longer satisfy, yet has not fully dissolved. What follows is not an act of will, but a moment of grace, a moment when something deeper begins to live itself, and the personal I quietly steps aside. When Joel Goldsmith spoke of the end of personal sense, he was not announcing a dramatic event, nor was he offering a goal to be achieved through discipline or will. He was pointing to a revelation so quiet, so natural, that it often goes unnoticed until it has already occurred. The words themselves can be misunderstood if they are heard by the personal mind, for the personal mind immediately imagines loss of individuality, loss of control, loss of meaning. But Joel was not speaking of loss. He was speaking of release. The end of personal sense does not mean the end of personality. It does not mean withdrawal from the world, nor does it mean indifference to human experience. It does not erase individuality. Rather, it reveals individuality in its true light as expression, not authorship. What ends is the belief that there is a separate someone here who is responsible for life, who must manage existence, who must carry the burden of becoming spiritual, healed, supplied, or complete. Joel discovered that the greatest suffering of humanity does not come from circumstance, but from identity. The personal sense assumes, I am the one living this life. And because it assumes this, it must also assume responsibility, fear, effort, and struggle. It must plan, defend, and strive. It must worry about past and future. It must carry the weight of success and failure. And yet, nowhere in Scripture do we find God placing this burden upon man. On the contrary, we hear again and again, cast thy burden upon the Lord, and he shall sustain thee. Not because God intervenes from outside, but because God is the life itself. When Joel spoke of the end of personal sense, he was describing the moment when this false sense of authorship quietly dissolves, not by force, not by denial, not by discipline, but by recognition. The soul begins to see that life has never been personal. Breath has never been personal. Intelligence has never been personal. Healing has never been personal. Even thought arises from a depth beyond the personal mind. In him we live and move and have our being. This is not poetry. It is fact. The personal sense believes it is the doer. Joel saw that this belief is the root of fear and limitation. Jesus never claimed personal doership. He did not say, I heal. He said, the Father that dwelleth in me, he doeth the works. He did not say, I supply. He said, your Father knoweth what things ye have need of before ye ask. He did not say, I live by my own power. He said, I can of mine own self do nothing. These were not statements of humility. They were revelations of identity. To the personal mind, this sounds like surrender, but in truth, it is freedom. For the moment the personal I ceases to claim ownership of life, life reveals itself as effortless, not passive, but guided, not inactive, but intelligent, not chaotic, but ordered. Joel discovered that when the personal sense steps aside even briefly, the Christ takes over, not as a power that arrives, but as the presence that has always been there. This is why the end of personal sense cannot be practiced. It cannot be willed. It cannot be imitated. The personal self cannot end itself, for any attempt to do so only strengthens it. The end comes when the soul sees clearly that the personal I was never the source of life to begin with. Except ye become as little children, ye shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. A child does not manage life. A child lives life. And in that living, life unfolds naturally. Joel often emphasized that nothing real is lost when personal sense dissolves. What is lost is anxiety. What is lost is strain. What is lost is the belief that one must earn God's favor or secure divine action. What remains is peace, not as emotion, but as state of being. My peace I give unto you, not as the world giveth, give I unto you. The peace of Christ is not dependent on circumstance, because it does not arise from circumstance. At first, the end of personal sense may be experienced only in moments, brief intervals, where thought stops claiming ownership, where awareness rests without reference to a personal center. In these moments, there is a sense of being carried, of being lived rather than living. Joel recognized these moments not as mystical experiences to be sought, but as glimpses of what has always been true. They are not departures from life, they are returns to reality. As personal sense fades, something remarkable is discovered. Life continues. The body functions. Thought occurs. Action happens. Decisions are made, yet there is no sense of a personal manager behind them. This is the great revelation. The vine does not struggle to bear fruit. The branch does not plan how to grow. I am the vine, ye are the branches. Life flows because life is its own source. This is why Joel called this the end of personal sense, not the end of life, but the end of false identity. And this end does not come with drama. It comes with relief. It comes with quiet joy. It comes with a deep inner assurance that one is no longer alone in existence because one never was. The Christ, the impersonal presence of God, has always been the life. The personal I was only the belief that obscured this truth. What lies ahead is not an achievement, but a yielding, not a becoming, but a remembering. The soul is now prepared to recognize the moment when the personal I does not merely loosen, but begins to fade, and in that fading, something eternal steps forward, not as something new, but as what has always been. There comes a moment, often unannounced, always quiet, when the personal sense of I begins to loosen its hold, not because it has been challenged, but because it has been seen. This moment does not arrive through effort, discipline, or spiritual achievement. It comes when effort has exhausted itself, when the seeker no longer knows how to seek, and the mind, having reached its limit, grows still. In that stillness, something deeper begins to reveal itself. This fading of the personal I does not feel like an event. There is no announcement within consciousness that says, now the personal self is ending. Rather, there is a subtle shift so gentle that it may be missed if one is looking for signs. One simply notices that life is happening without being managed. Breath flows without instruction. Thought arises without direction. Awareness is present without effort. And in that noticing, a quiet realization dawns. I am not doing this. The personal I has always believed itself to be the center, the origin, the author of experience. But in this moment of stillness, awareness begins to recognize itself as prior to thought, prior to choice, prior even to identity. The question is no longer asked in words, yet it is deeply present. Who is aware? And because this question is not asked by the intellect, it receives no mental answer. It opens a space, and in that space, the personal I cannot stand. Scripture points to this moment again and again, though it is often read too quickly. Not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit, saith the Lord. The fading of the personal I is not an act of might. It is not power exerted by the will. It is the yielding of attention from effort to presence. It is the soul discovering that it has been standing on holy ground all along. At first, this fading may occur only briefly, perhaps in prayer when words fall away, perhaps in silence when no thought demands attention, perhaps in a moment of deep listening when awareness rests without direction. In these moments, there is no sense of I am doing this. There is only being. And in that being, there is peace, not as an emotion, but as a natural state. Peace, be still, Jesus said. He was not speaking to the sea. He was revealing the nature of consciousness when personal sense is absent. The personal I fades not because it is removed, but because it is no longer believed. It is seen as a habit of thought, a pattern of identification, rather than the truth of being. And when belief withdraws, the structure collapses quietly without resistance. There is no battle here. Truth does not fight illusion, it reveals it. Light does not destroy darkness, it exposes it. As this fading begins, fear loses its foundation. Fear requires a personal center to threaten, a self to protect, a future to control. But when awareness rests as presence rather than person, fear has no place to attach. This is why Jesus could say, "Be not afraid," not as comfort, but as description. In the presence of God, fear cannot arise, because God is not a person who can be harmed. The mind may attempt to reassert itself at this stage. It may ask, "What is happening? Am I doing this right? How do I stay here?" But these questions themselves belong to the personal I, and the moment they are noticed as such, they lose their authority. The fading continues, not by resisting these thoughts, but by seeing them for what they are, movements within consciousness, not the consciousness itself. Joel understood that this moment cannot be prolonged by effort. It can only be allowed. The more one tries to hold on to the experience, the more the personal I returns. The fading occurs when one stops trying to fade. "He that loseth his life for my sake shall find it." This losing is not an act. It is the natural consequence of recognition. As the personal I recedes, something else becomes evident. Life remains. Intelligence remains. Love remains. Functioning remains. There is no void, no emptiness, no absence. What disappears is tension. What disappears is the sense of being alone in existence. What disappears is the belief that one must make life work in its place. There is a quiet assurance that life is working itself. This is the moment Joel referred to not as awakening, but as awakening from the belief that one was ever separate from the source of life, awakening from the assumption that the personal self was necessary for God to act, awakening from the long-held habit of identifying with limitation. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. This liberty is not freedom to do, it is freedom from doing. The fading of the personal I is not the end of the journey. It is the opening through which the Christ, the impersonal presence of God, begins to reveal itself, not as something entering consciousness, but as what consciousness has always been. And this revelation does not shout, it whispers. It makes itself known not through experience, but through certainty. A certainty without words, a knowing without thought. The soul does not claim this moment. It does not say, "I have arrived," for the one who would claim it is no longer there. There is simply being present, aware, whole, and in this being, the seeker has quietly ceased to be a seeker at all. When the personal I begins to fade, something else quietly comes into view, not as a vision, not as an experience, not as a new state to be attained, but as a recognition so simple that it had long been overlooked. What reveals itself is the Christ, not the Christ of history, not the Christ of doctrine, not the Christ confined to a person or a time, but the Christ as living presence, the impersonal reality of God expressing his being. This revelation does not come to the personal self, it comes in the absence of the personal self. For as long as there is a sense of I am the one seeking God, the Christ remains obscured. But when that sense loosens, when authorship is relinquished, the Christ stands revealed as what has always been. Before Abraham was, I am. Not I was, not I became, but I am. Eternal, changeless, impersonal presence. The Christ is not something that enters consciousness at this moment. It does not arrive from elsewhere. It does not descend, appear, or activate. the Christ is uncovered. It is recognized as the very substance of awareness itself. Joel saw clearly that the Christ is not a quality added to humanity. It is the divine identity that humanity has mistaken itself to be separate from. And in this recognition, the long search ends not because the goal has been reached, but because the seeker has dissolved. This is why Jesus never spoke of the Christ as a possession. He did not say, "I have the Christ." He spoke as the Christ. "I and the Father are one." These words were not claims of superiority. They were revelations of identity. He was not elevating himself above humanity. He was revealing what is true of all being when personal sense is absent, that they all may be one, as thou, Father, art in me, and I in thee. The Christ is impersonal. This must be understood deeply, for the personal mind resists it. The mind wants a God with preference, a Christ who chooses, blesses, withholds, rewards. But the Christ that reveals itself when personal sense fades is free of human attributes. It does not act upon you, it acts as you. It does not guide from outside, it unfolds from within. It does not intervene, it expresses. Joel discovered that when the Christ reveals itself, life is no longer lived from need. Prayer ceases to be request and becomes recognition. Healing ceases to be an effort to change conditions and becomes the realization that the Christ is never conditioned. Supply ceases to be something sought and is revealed as the infinite nature of being itself. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Not because God provides from afar, but because God is the life that knows no lack. The Christ reveals itself as peace, but not the peace of circumstances. It is the peace which passeth all understanding, because it does not arise from thought. It is the peace of identity, the certainty that being is whole. In this presence, there is no struggle to forgive, because there is no personal center to be offended. There is no effort to love, because love is the nature of the Christ itself. There is no fear of loss, because the Christ cannot be diminished. When this impersonal Christ reveals itself, there is a profound shift in perception. The world is no longer encountered as something happening to you. It is seen as something arising within consciousness. People are no longer separate entities acting upon you. They are expressions of the same life, appearing in different forms. Circumstances are no longer interpreted as threats or rewards. They are movements within the one presence. Judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment. Righteous judgment is seeing from the Christ, not from the personal self. Joel emphasized that this revelation is not mystical in the sense of being extraordinary. It is mystical only because it is misunderstood. In truth, it is the most natural recognition possible. The unnatural state has been the belief in separation. The Christ is simply what remains when that belief dissolves. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. The Word is not language, it is being. It is the living presence that speaks itself as existence. The personal mind may still arise after this recognition. Thoughts may still appear, human emotions may still pass through, but they are no longer owned. They are seen as movements on the surface of consciousness, not definitions of identity. The Christ remains untouched by them. They shall come nigh thee, but shall not come unto thee. This is not protection from experience. It is freedom from identification. The impersonal Christ does not make life dramatic. It makes life simple. There is a deep sense of rightness, of order, of quiet joy that does not depend on outcome. Decisions arise without anxiety. Action flows without strain. Silence becomes familiar, not empty. One begins to understand why Jesus withdrew so often into solitude, not to escape life, but to rest in the awareness from which life flows. This is the Christ Joel discovered not as doctrine, not as theology, but as living reality. A reality that cannot be claimed by a person because it erases the very sense of personal ownership. A reality that belongs to no one and expresses through anyone who becomes still enough to let it be. It is not ye that speak, but the Spirit of your Father which speaketh in you. The Christ does not announce itself. It does not say, I am here. It reveals itself as the absence of strain, the end of seeking, the quiet certainty of being. And once recognized, even faintly, it cannot be forgotten, for it is not something known by the mind, it is what the mind itself arises from. When the Christ reveals itself as impersonal presence, something quietly but irrevocably changes in the inner life. Effort begins to fall away, not because one decides to stop striving, but because striving is seen to have no place in truth. Effort belongs to the personal sense of identity. It arises from the belief that something is missing, that something must be attained, that something must be fixed or improved. But when truth is recognized, lack is exposed as illusion, and effort has nothing left to accomplish. Joel understood that effort is always the activity of a seeker who believes himself separate from what he seeks. As long as there is a sense of distance between oneself and God, effort feels necessary. Prayer becomes petition, meditation becomes discipline, spiritual life becomes a task. But when the Christ is recognized as the very life that is living you, the foundation of effort collapses. One does not strive to become what one already is. Jesus never taught effort as a path to God. His words were consistently invitations into rest. Take my yoke upon you, and ye shall find rest unto your souls. A yoke implies union, not labor. It implies that life is already being carried, already directed, already sustained. The soul that recognizes this no longer struggles to align with God. It discovers that it has never been out of alignment. My Father worketh hitherto, and I work. The work is God's, not personal. Effort ends because truth is not achieved, it is acknowledged. This is a crucial distinction. Effort attempts to make something true. Recognition allows what is true to be seen. The personal mind cannot understand this because it is conditioned to equate value with activity. But the Christ reveals a different order of being, one in which life unfolds by intelligence, not by strain. When effort falls away, this does not result in passivity. On the contrary, action becomes more precise, more appropriate, more effective, but it is no longer driven by anxiety or ambition. It arises naturally, like breath. Joel often spoke of the difference between human will and divine unfoldment. Human will pushes, divine unfoldment reveals, and revelation requires no effort, only receptivity. This is why Jesus could say, "Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow, they toil not, neither do they spin." He was not offering poetic imagery. He was revealing a law of being. Life does not struggle to be life. Growth does not force itself. Supply does not chase itself. These are human distortions arising from personal sense. When truth is recognized, the natural order resumes. Effort also ends because fear dissolves. Fear is the fuel of effort. It whispers, if you do not do something, something will go wrong. But when the Christ is recognized as the source and substance of being, fear loses its authority. One sees that life is not fragile, It does not depend on personal management. Which of you, by taking thought, can add 1 cubit unto his stature? Thought cannot sustain life because thought did not create it. In the absence of effort, prayer changes completely. One no longer prays to God. One rests in God. Prayer becomes a listening, a stillness, a yielding. The soul no longer tries to reach God. It allows God to reveal itself. Speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth. This hearing is not auditory. It is awareness. It is the quiet knowing that arises when the personal voice falls silent. Joel saw that effort is often mistaken for devotion, but devotion that is rooted in effort remains centered in the personal self. True devotion is surrender, not surrender of behavior, but surrender of authorship. It is the willingness to let life be lived from its own source. And this surrender is not heroic. It is gentle. It comes when the soul is tired of carrying what it was never meant to carry. When effort ends, one begins to notice something remarkable. Life continues to function perfectly well. Decisions are made. Responsibilities are met. Relationships unfold. Yet there is no inattention around them. The sense of, I must make this happen, fades. In its place, there is trust not as belief, but as experience. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. Understanding here refers to personal calculation. Trust is the recognition of divine intelligence already at work. This is not a state that must be maintained. There is nothing to guard, nothing to preserve. The Christ does not come and go. What comes and goes is personal effort. And each time effort returns, it is gently seen and released, not fought, not judged, simply recognized as unnecessary. Over time, effort becomes less frequent, less compelling, until it loses its grip altogether. Effort ends because truth stands complete. Nothing needs to be added to it. Nothing needs to be improved. The Christ does not evolve. It is already whole. And when identity rests in this wholeness, life becomes simple, not because circumstances are controlled, but because identity is no longer divided. Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee. Peace is not created. It is uncovered when the mind ceases its restless striving. This is the freedom Joel discovered, the freedom of not having to make life work, the freedom of being lived rather than living. And in this freedom, one finds that what had been sought through effort appears naturally, effortlessly, as the quiet outflow of divine being. As effort fades and truth stands revealed, a natural consequence begins to unfold quietly, inevitably. Fear, lack, and burden begin to lose their substance, not because they are fought, denied, or overcome, but because the identity that sustained them is no longer believed. These conditions have always depended upon the personal sense of self for their existence. When that sense dissolves, they find no place to remain. Fear has never belonged to life itself. Fear belongs to the belief that life is personal, vulnerable, and separate from its source. A self that believes it must protect itself will always fear loss. A self that believes it must secure its future will always fear uncertainty. But when the Christ is recognized as the very life that lives you, fear is exposed as groundless. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? This is not courage. It is recognition. Fear does not disappear all at once. At first, it may still arise as a habit, a reflex of old identification, but it no longer has authority. It is seen rather than obeyed. Awareness notices fear without becoming it, and the moment fear is seen as an appearance within consciousness rather than a truth about being, it begins to dissolve. Perfect love casteth out fear. This love is not emotional. It is the impersonal certainty of divine presence. Lack follows the same pattern. Lack is not an external condition, it is an identity. It arises from the belief that one is separate from supply, that good must come from somewhere else, that life withholds unless earned. But the Christ reveals a different reality. Supply is not something added to life. It is the nature of life itself. The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof. When identity rests in the Christ, the idea of lack loses its meaning. This does not mean that circumstances immediately change. It means that circumstances no longer define identity. The soul no longer says, I lack. It sees that the I is not a person in need, but the presence through which life expresses. And as this recognition deepens, the outer experience begins naturally, without force to reflect the inner abundance. Joel often said that supply appears when we stop looking for it personally and allow it to reveal itself impersonally. Burden is perhaps the most persistent of all, because it wears the disguise of responsibility. The personal self believes it must carry the weight of life, relationships, obligations, decisions, outcomes, and because it believes this, it feels burdened. Jesus addressed this directly when he said, My yoke is easy and my burden is light. He was not minimizing human experience. He was revealing a different yoke, a different source of action. When the Christ lives as you, responsibility shifts. You no longer carry life. Life carries you. You do not abandon action, but action is no longer personal. You respond rather than react. You act without strain. You fulfill responsibilities without feeling owned by them. The burden dissolves because the sense of personal ownership dissolves. Cast thy care upon him, for he careth for you. This casting is not an act of will. It is the natural result of recognition. As fear, lack, and burden fade, something else becomes evident, a deep inner stability that does not depend on conditions. The world may still present challenges. Situations may still arise that would once have triggered anxiety, but they no longer penetrate to the center of being. 1,000 shall fall at thy side, but it shall not come nigh thee. This is not protection from experience. It is freedom from identification. The disappearance of these conditions does not make one indifferent or detached from life. On the contrary, it allows life to be met with clarity and compassion. One becomes more present, more attentive, more responsive, but there is no inner weight. No sense of this should not be happening to me. No resistance to what appears. Acceptance is not resignation. It is alignment with what is. Joel discovered that healing often occurs most naturally at this stage, not because one seeks it, but because the belief that sustained illness dissolves. Illness has always depended upon identification with the body and personal mind. When identity rests in the Christ, the body is no longer the self. It is the instrument, and the Christ being whole expresses wholeness naturally. Beloved, I wish above all things that thou mayest prosper and be in health. This is not a request. It is a statement of divine nature. The disappearance of fear, lack, and burden is not dramatic. It is quiet. One day, you simply notice that something that once troubled you no longer does. Something that once felt heavy now feels neutral. Something that once caused anxiety now passes through awareness without disturbance. There is no announcement of victory. There is only relief. This relief is not emotional happiness. It is the absence of tension. It is the absence of resistance. It is the freedom of not having to be someone who must manage life. And in this freedom, the Christ continues to unfold itself not as an experience, but as the natural state of being. The soul begins to understand, not intellectually, but inwardly, why Jesus could sleep in the boat while the storm raged. The storm did not disturb him because it did not define him. The Christ within is never threatened by appearances. And when this is recognized, even faintly, the storm loses its power, not always to cease, but to disturb. When fear, lack, and burden fall away, the soul begins to discover a way of living that is entirely different from what it once assumed was necessary. Life continues, yet it is no longer driven by a personal author. There is action without anxiety, movement without strain, decision without inner conflict. One begins to live without the constant sense that I must make life happen. This is not something that is learned. It is something that is noticed. Life reveals itself as self-operating. Thoughts arise, but they are not claimed. Actions occur, but they are not owned. Words are spoken, but they are not rehearsed. The personal I no longer stands at the center directing experience. It has quietly stepped aside, and in its place, something deeper is living itself. Joel understood this as divine unfoldment, not a plan imposed from above, not a destiny enforced by will, but the natural movement of intelligence expressing as form. It is God which worketh in you both to will and to do of his good pleasure. This is not a metaphor. It is a statement of fact. The will that moves life is not personal, it is divine. And when this is recognized, resistance dissolves. Living without a personal author does not mean that individuality disappears. On the contrary, individuality becomes more authentic. Personality is no longer strained by self-consciousness. It is no longer burdened by comparison or self-protection. It expresses freely, creatively, uniquely, without trying to be anything. The personal self had always tried to be something. The Christ simply is. In this state, one no longer asks, "What should I do?" The question dissolves because action arises naturally from awareness. One no longer tries to control outcomes because outcomes are no longer personal achievements or failures. One no longer fears making mistakes because there is no personal image to defend. The steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord. Ordered does not mean dictated. It means aligned. This way of living is not passive. It is profoundly alive, but it is free of inner commentary. There is no constant evaluation of experience, no measuring of success, no replaying of past decisions. Life is met as it appears, responded to as needed, and released as it passes. This is what Jesus meant when he said, "Take therefore no thought for the morrow." He was not discouraging care. He was revealing trust in divine order. When there is no personal author, relationships change. Others are no longer seen as threats or resources. They are seen as expressions of the same life. There is less judgment, not because one tries to be compassionate, but because separation is no longer believed. Forgiveness happens naturally because there is no personal self to be injured. Love flows without effort because love is the nature of the Christ. Work changes as well. One still acts, still creates, still contributes, but without the weight of self-definition. Work is no longer a means of proving worth or securing identity. It becomes an expression of life moving through form. Joel often emphasized that when work is impersonal, it is effective, harmonious, and satisfying. It is not your work. It is the work of God unfolding as activity. Even challenges are experienced differently. Difficulties may still arise, but they are no longer interpreted as personal problems. They are seen as movements within consciousness, not threats to identity. The mind no longer rushes to fix, control, or resist. There is space, and in that space, solutions often reveal themselves without struggle. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. Standing still is not inactivity. It is the absence of personal interference. Living without a personal author brings a deep sense of trust, not trust in something, but trust as something. Trust becomes the natural state of being when one is no longer trying to manage life from a limited center. One feels carried, guided, sustained, not emotionally, but existentially. The question, am I safe, no longer arises, because safety is no longer sought in circumstances. It is recognized as inherent in being. This way of living does not make one extraordinary. It makes one ordinary in the truest sense. One eats, works, rests, speaks, listens, without spiritual self-consciousness. The Christ does not seek recognition. It does not announce itself. It lives quietly, naturally, invisibly. When thou doest alms, let not thy left hand know what thy right hand doeth. This is not moral instruction. It is a description of impersonal action. Over time, the absence of a personal author becomes so natural that one forgets there was ever another way to live. The strain of self-management fades into memory. The constant inner dialogue quiets. Life feels simple not because it is controlled, but because it is no longer resisted. And in this simplicity, there is joy, not excitement, but a steady, quiet gladness that arises for no reason. This is not the end. It is the beginning of a deeper embodiment. For when life is no longer lived by a person, it begins to live fully as the Christ, and what follows is not effort, not discipline, not practice, but a natural unfolding in which truth moves from recognition into lived reality. There comes a point on the spiritual path where nothing further can be added, not because understanding is complete in the mind, but because the need to add has fallen away. This is why what Joel Goldsmith discovered at the end of his journey was not a new teaching, not a higher principle, not a more refined method, but the quiet recognition that all teaching points to the same unveiling, the end of the personal sense of I and the full living of the Christ as identity. Joel did not call this discovery final because it was dramatic or superior to earlier insights. He called it final because nothing remains beyond it that can be sought. Every earlier revelation, healing, supply, harmony, peace, finds its source here. When the personal I dissolves, all that had been sought through effort is revealed as already present. There is no longer a path to walk because the walker has disappeared into the ground on which the path appeared. Throughout his life, Joel spoke of healing, of prayer, of meditation, of spiritual listening. But in his later years, it became increasingly clear that these were not ends in themselves. They were doorways, and once the door is passed through, the doorway is no longer needed. Healing is not the goal, identity is. Supply is not the goal, identity is. Peace is not the goal, identity is. When identity rests in the Christ, these appear naturally, without pursuit. Joel realized that as long as there is someone seeking God, the seeking must continue. But when the seeker is seen as a concept rather than a reality, the search ends not in disappointment, but in fulfillment. Seek, and ye shall find, Jesus said. But he did not say what would be found. What is found is not an object, Not an experience, not a state, but the absence of the one who was seeking. This is why the end of personal sense is not something the world celebrates. It offers no badge of achievement. It produces no identity to display. It does not make one special. It makes one free. And freedom, in its truest sense, is invisible. The kingdom of God cometh not with observation. There is nothing to point to, nothing to demonstrate, only a life quietly lived from a different center, or rather, from no center at all. Joel understood that this discovery could not be reached earlier in the journey, not because it was withheld, but because consciousness was not yet ready to release its most cherished illusion, the belief in personal authorship. Humanity could let go of sin before it could let go of identity. It could release fear before it could release control. But eventually, every soul must face the simple, unsettling truth that life has never been personal. This is why Joel spoke so gently in his later teachings. He was no longer explaining principles. He was allowing truth to speak for itself. He knew that the final discovery could not be taught. It could only be recognized. Words could prepare the way, but silence would do the work. In quietness and in confidence shall be your strength. Strength here is not power. It is stability in being. Nothing in this discovery negates the earlier journey. Prayer was not wasted. Seeking was not mistaken. Effort was not wrong. All of it served to bring consciousness to the point where it could finally let go. Just as a ladder is not despised because it is set aside once the roof is reached, the spiritual practices of earliest stages are honored even as they fall away. The mistake would be to cling to them after their purpose has been fulfilled. Joel saw that the greatest misunderstanding of spirituality is the belief that it is about becoming something. But becoming implies time, effort, and distance. The Christ is not something you become. It is what remains when becoming ends. I am that I am, not I will be, not I hope to be, simply I am. Eternal, impersonal presence. This was the simplicity of Joel's final realization. There is no personal self to perfect, no personal consciousness to enlighten, no personal life to save. What appears as personal has always been an appearance within the infinite, and when this is recognized, the entire burden of spiritual attainment dissolves. One does not abandon life. One finally rests in it. The final discovery is not dramatic. It does not change the outer story in ways the world would recognize. But inwardly, everything is different. The sense of being a spiritual seeker gives way to the quiet knowing of being spiritual presence. The urgency to understand disappears. The need to explain fades. One lives, moves, and has being without commentary. For of him, and through him, and to him, are all things. This is why nothing more needs to be said after this discovery. Not because there is nothing more to know, but because knowing has given way to being. Words naturally fall silent. Teaching becomes presence. And life unfolds, moment by moment, without reference to a personal center, free, whole, complete. Now we come to a place where words themselves must begin to withdraw. Not because they are no longer true, but because truth has been spoken far enough to point beyond itself. What remains cannot be practiced, cannot be remembered, cannot be carried forward by effort. It can only be entered quietly, naturally, without intention. This is not an instruction to meditate. It is not a suggestion to become still. Stillness is already present. What is invited here is simply the ceasing of interference, the gentle release of the habit of doing something about life, about thought, about awareness itself. Be still and know that I am God. This knowing does not arise after stillness. It is revealed as stillness. There is nothing to achieve in this moment, no posture to assume, no thought to hold, no feeling to produce. Any attempt to do so belongs to the personal sense that has already been seen through. The invitation is simpler than that. It is to notice that awareness is already present effortlessly, silently, without your help. You do not create awareness, you do not sustain it, you do not direct it, it simply is. Here, the mind may attempt to listen, to understand, to follow along, but even that is unnecessary. The Christ is not revealed through attention, it is revealed through the absence of effortful attention. When the mind rests, awareness remains. When thought pauses, being continues. When personal identity quiets, life does not disappear, it becomes evident. This stillness is not emptiness. It is fullness without form. It is the quiet background in which all sound appears. It is the unmoving presence in which all movement occurs. It is the same stillness that Jesus withdrew into when he went alone into the mountain, not to escape the world, but to rest as the source from which the world arises. There is no one here who must do this correctly. There is no right way to enter stillness, because stillness is not entered, it is recognized. The moment you notice that you are aware, without needing to define who or what is aware, you are already here. The Christ does not arrive later. It is present now, closer than breath, nearer than thought. This is why Joel so often emphasized silence not as a discipline, but as a natural state. Silence is not the absence of noise, it is the absence of personal commentary. It is the quiet in which life speaks itself. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. The holy temple is not a place, it is consciousness itself. In this stillness, nothing is asked of you. You are not required to let go of thoughts. Thoughts will come and go. You are not required to feel peace. Peace is already present as the nature of being. You are not required to trust. Trust is inherent when there is no personal center trying to control. Simply rest without effort in the awareness that is already here. This resting is not something you do. It happens when doing ceases. It is the same resting that occurs just before sleep, when the day's concerns lose their urgency and identity loosens without resistance. But here, awareness remains awake. This is not unconsciousness. It is conscious being without self-definition. In this stillness, the Christ is not experienced as an object. It is not perceived. It is what perceives. It is not something you are aware of. It is the awareness itself. And because of this, it cannot be grasped or held. It can only be lived. In him we live and move and have our being, not as belief, but as fact. Nothing more is required here. There is no next step, no deeper level to reach, no further revelation to seek. The stillness does not lead somewhere else. It is the ground. And as you rest here even briefly, you may notice a quiet certainty, a gentle ease, a sense of being exactly where you are meant to be, not emotionally, but existentially. This is not an experience to remember later. It is not something to recreate. It does not belong to time. It reveals itself whenever the personal sense relaxes its hold. And once recognized, even faintly, it leaves a mark not on memory, but on identity. Something within knows that life is not being lived personally, it is being lived divinely. And so we do not conclude this moment, we do not end it, We simply allow it to be what it is, present, complete, untouched by effort. Words now step aside, not because they have failed, but because they have done what they came to do, point you back to the stillness that has always been here. When stillness is recognized not as a state to enter, but as the ground of being, something becomes unmistakably clear. Life has always been living itself. What once appeared as personal effort is seen, in hindsight, as unnecessary interference. What once felt like decision-making is recognized as unfoldment. The sense that I am living my life gently dissolves, and in its place there is a quiet awareness that life is living itself as you. This is not a new experience. It is a new interpretation of what has always been happening. The heart has always beaten without instruction. Breath has always moved without permission. Intelligence has always coordinated the body, the mind, the environment, without consulting the personal self. Thou hast beset me behind and before, and laid thine hand upon me. This is not supervision from above. It is the intimacy of life itself. The life that lives itself does not announce its presence. It does not say, "Now I am guiding you." It simply unfolds. You may find yourself saying the right words without planning them, taking the right steps without calculating them, resting when rest is needed and acting when action is required. There is no sense of "I chose this wisely." There is only the quiet recognition that what needed to happen, happened. This does not make life mechanical or impersonal in the human sense. On the contrary, it brings a deeper warmth, a gentler intelligence, a more responsive sensitivity to each moment. But this responsiveness does not arise from vigilance. It arises from availability. The personal self no longer stands between life and its expression. "Here am I, send me." This is not a personal declaration. It is the readiness of consciousness to be lived. As the life that lives itself becomes evident, self-concern fades. One no longer watches oneself living. One no longer evaluates each thought, emotion, or action. Life flows forward without commentary. There is a sense of ease, not because circumstances are perfect, but because identity is no longer invested in controlling them. Let this mind be in you which was also in Christ Jesus. This mind is not a way of thinking. It is the absence of personal thinking. In this way of being, even mistakes lose their sting. There is no personal failure to defend against, no image to repair. What appears as error is simply another movement in consciousness, quickly corrected by the same intelligence that guides all things. Regret has no foothold, because there is no personal past to relive. Anticipation loses its urgency, because there is no personal future to secure. Life unfolds now, and now is enough. Joel often spoke of this as divine government, not a rule imposed upon life, but the natural order of being when personal sense no longer governs. Divine government does not plan, it reveals. It does not control, it harmonizes. And when it is recognized, one stops asking for direction and begins to notice that direction has always been present. The Lord shall guide thee continually, not occasionally, continually. In this living, prayer becomes wordless. Gratitude arises without object. Love flows without condition. One does not feel holy, spiritual, or enlightened. One feels normal, perhaps more normal than ever before. The tension that once accompanied identity is gone. Life feels lighter, simpler, quieter, not empty full, but full without weight. This is why the Christ does not draw attention to itself. It does not seek expression. It is expression. It does not need recognition. It is recognition. And as this life lives itself, the world may or may not notice. That is of no importance. The Christ is not concerned with impact. It is concerned only with being what it is. The life that lives itself does not withdraw from the world. It meets the world without fear. It engages without attachment. It loves without possession. It serves without sacrifice. Freely ye have received, freely give. There is no sense of giving something personal. What flows through you was never yours to begin with. Gradually, almost without noticing, one stops asking spiritual questions, not because curiosity is gone, but because the need for answers has ended. Life itself is the answer. Each moment reveals exactly what is required and nothing more. There is a deep trust, not in outcomes, not in beliefs, but in being itself. This is not a state to maintain. There is nothing to hold. There is no danger of losing it because there is no personal owner to lose it. The Christ does not come and go. Only attention wanders. And each time attention returns to stillness, to presence, to the simple fact of being, the truth stands revealed again, unchanged, untouched. And so life continues. Days unfold. Experiences arise and pass. But beneath it all, there is a quiet knowing that nothing essential is at stake. Life is not a problem to be solved. It is a mystery to be lived, and it is living itself now, as always. And now there is nothing further to say, not because the subject has been exhausted, but because it has returned to its source. Truth does not end, it rests. What has been spoken has not been offered as knowledge to remember, but as a gentle turning inward back to the awareness that has been present from the beginning. There is no conclusion to draw, no lesson to apply, no direction to take from here. Any attempt to do so would return us to the personal sense that believes something must follow. But what has been revealed does not lead onward. It stands here complete, sufficient, whole. I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the ending. Truth begins nowhere and ends nowhere because it has never been absent. If something has been recognized, even faintly, it was not given by these words. It was remembered. The Christ was not introduced. It was uncovered. The personal I was not destroyed. It was seen through. Nothing has changed, and yet everything is different, not outwardly, but inwardly, where change no longer matters. There is no need now to hold on to any of this. Truth is not fragile. It does not require protection or repetition. It does not grow stronger through attention. It simply is, and it will reveal itself again whenever the personal sense relaxes, whether in silence, in stillness, in ordinary moments of life, or in the quiet space between thoughts. You are not asked to live differently. Life will live itself. You are not asked to remember these words. What is true does not depend on memory. You are not asked to become the Christ. The Christ has always been the life that is living you. Know ye not that ye are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you? This dwelling is not conditional. It has never been earned, and it cannot be lost. And so, we do not end with instruction. We do not end with affirmation. We do not end with prayer. We end where we began, in stillness. Not the stillness created by silence, but the stillness that remains even when sound returns. The stillness that underlies thought. The stillness that is aware of these words even now. Rest there if rest happens. Move on if movement happens. Forget these words if forgetting happens. None of it alters what is. The Christ does not wait for recognition. It does not depend on attention. It does not improve with understanding. It is the I that is living, breathing, seeing, knowing here, now, always. And when nothing more is sought, nothing more is needed, life continues. Grace unfolds. The burden has already fallen away. The seeker has already dissolved. What remains has never been absent. This is not the end of a message. It is the end of the one who needed a message.